Hey there everybody, I'm Joe the Disney Guy and welcome to another Disney Guy review. Today we're going to be taking a look at the Disney film with possibly the most tumultuous behind the scenes drama in their history, The Fox and the Hound. At the height of its power in the 1950s, the Disney Animation Studio was a juggernaut, with over 250 employees working on featured films, among other projects. But as time had worn on, technology improved, budgets got tighter, and the returns were no longer as high, that number had been pared down dramatically, and by the 1970s, Disney didn't even hire animators unless it was absolutely necessary, employing only 21 new animators from 1970 through 1977. Now, some of this is on Disney obviously for not hiring new people, but some of it is just a corner that they got painted into. You see, a traditional trope among animators is that they never really have to retire. So when you have a group of old school animators who have brought the company to new heights and have become legends of the industry who also have no real desire or need to retire, you have yourself a little bit of a dilemma. To try and counter their rapidly aging animation team, as well as begin prep for the future, the Disney company added an extension to their animation training school, which became known as the California Institute of the Arts. By the time 1976 rolled around, the first graduates of the animation program at CalArts were brought on by Disney as trainees. The whole concept of the partnership between CalArts and Disney is a brilliant and, quite frankly, underrated factor that led to Disney's great success in the 90s. We'll probably delve deeper into that another day, but for now just know that CalArts plus Disney equals high-quality animators. Meanwhile, the ever-present quest for Disney's next animated film fell to Wolfgang Reitherman, who decided to adapt the 1967 novel The Fox and the Hound by Daniel P. Mannix. Despite its dark and brooding storyline, Reitherman felt a connection with the novel, due in part to his family actually owning a pet fox for a time, and felt that an adaptation with some major plot changes would be possible. With the concept in mind, production on the adaptation of The Fox and the Hound began in the spring of 1977. Early production on The Fox and the Hound began much like many of the previous Disney productions had started. Leading the animation was Frank Thomas and Ollie Johnston, while overseeing the entire project as director was Wolfgang Reitherman. However, there was one major difference in that Reitherman had a co-director, longtime studio hand Art Stevens, as well as a new president to answer to, Walt Disney's son-in-law Ron Miller. Almost immediately, there was friction between Reitherman and Stevens, primarily revolving around the differing ideas on the direction of the film and production. I mean, this had to be expected, right? Anyone who's ever been involved in co-directing will tell you that there's bound to be some disagreement and friction between two creative minds, and when you consider that the thought was going around that Reitherman's tried and true methods may be getting a little bit dated, this was a situation that was pretty much bound to fail. Even though Stevens was 60 at the time of production, it was only his second directorial effort, so it was still a battle of old versus new to an extent. Complicating things for Reitherman, Ron Miller tended to side with Stevens when it came to their disputes, even requesting that Reitherman turn the reins on production over to the younger talent, which Reitherman resisted due to a lack of faith in the more inexperienced crew. Among the animators, a very similar scenario was playing out, with the grizzled veterans being hesitant to give major sequences to the new upstarts in their department, for fear that they weren't ready to match the quality that they demanded. Of course, you can make the argument that Johnston and Thomas were just employing some tough love tactics with the young animators to instill upon them the same high-quality standards that they created. But once again, we're looking at an old versus new situation, and even though that's very common even today, it can certainly help create a very toxic environment, especially when it comes to creative endeavors like making a movie. Eventually, however, Johnston and Thomas retired together in 1978 after initial animations were completed, and made way for the new crop of animators featuring Glenn Keane, Brad Bird, Tim Burton, John Lasseter, Chris Buck, John Musker, and Ron Clements, among others. Unfortunately for the final holdover of the 9 old men, these young animators also tended to support the ideas of Art Stevens over Reitherman. This division was finally brought to a head when Reitherman, feeling that the second act of the film needed some more life, decided to add a musical sequence for a comedic song entitled Scooby Dooby Dooby Doo, Let Your Body Turn Goo. The song would be sung by two Cranes, voiced by Reitherman favorite Phil Harris and actress/comedian Charo, and there's even reference footage of Charo shot for the sequence. The decision caused uproar among the younger personnel in Stevens, feeling that the song had no place within the movie as it was constructed. Stevens brought his dispute to the higher-ups, and after numerous story meetings, the sequence was eventually scrapped. Following this decision, Reitherman bowed out of the project. The story goes that after the decision to can the sequence was made, a worn-out Reitherman conceded that maybe this is a young man's game after all. This is something you see in sports all the time when the old veteran has to finally realize that time may have passed him by and that maybe it's a younger guy's time to shine. It's a sobering realization that not many people can make, and for Reitherman, it took nearly the entire studio rejecting his idea for him to realize it was time to move on. Despite the veterans taking their leave, though, problems and controversy during production would remain. A debate broke out among the staff regarding the fate of the character Chief. In early versions, Chief died after his accident, much like in the novel, but Stevens decided to alter the scene in order to spare Chief. Many in the story department, including Ron Clements, argued that Chief had to die in order to give Copper the motivation to seek revenge on Todd, but Stevens continued to balk at the idea, saying that no Disney main character died before, and he wasn't going to start now. I gotta debate that point. Is Bambi's mom ringing a bell, anyone? There were even problems in casting the voices for the film. Disney regulars Pat Buttram, Paul Winchell, and Mickey Rooney were cast as Chief, Boomer, and Todd, respectively. Actress and singer Pearl Bailey was cast as Big Mama, and Jack Albertson was brought on as Amos Slade, with child actors Keith Coogan and Corey Feldman voicing the young Todd and Copper. The problem, however, was with the casting of adult Copper and Widow Tweed. Actresses Lillian Gish and Helen Hayes were both offered the role of Widow Tweed, but both turned it down, leaving the role to Jeanette Nolan, who had just worked on The Rescuers. As for Copper, actor Jackie Cooper auditioned for and was offered the role, but turned it down when the studio wasn't willing to pay the price he demanded. Instead, the role went to former Disney child star Kurt Russell, who managed to record all of his lines in only 2 sessions. It's one of the glaring factors that something was just off at the Disney studio around this time. Very rarely, if ever, have we heard of people declining work for Disney, and with so many people doing it on this film, just kind of shows that Disney didn't have the same sway that they used to 30 years ago. But the biggest disaster the studio faced during production was the departure of director and animator Don Bluth, along with 15 other animators from the studio. The exodus cut Disney's animation force by 17% and forced Ron Miller to postpone the release of The Fox and the Hound from December of 1980 to summer of 1981. Okay, so I know this is a huge turning point in the history of Disney Studios, and I kinda just glossed over it just now, but with so much to talk about in this video, I just don't have the time to adequately do the story justice. But maybe in my next video, though. Bluth had been promoted to co-director before his departure, and in his absence, writer and composer Rick Rich was bumped up to take his place. In addition to helping with directing duties, Rich, along with Ollie Johnston's son, Richard O. Johnston, also composed the music for the film, working with lyricists Stan Fidel, Jim Stafford, and Jeffrey Patch to write the songs. The idea of being a director/composer is so interesting and so terrifying to me. Certainly you get a little more extra sway in how your movie's being presented, but oh man, with the responsibilities of both positions rolled into one, it's just so much work. There was also a big push internally to try and keep the film to a family-friendly G rating, despite the somewhat heavier nature of the story. A lot of this hinged on the climactic bear scene at the end of the film, which in its original storyboards was far more intense and dramatic. However, with fear among the directors of losing a G rating, Glenn Keane was assigned the task of re-storyboarding and reanimating the scene numerous times to achieve dramatic tension without bumping the film up to a PG rating. So it may seem silly to you and me today to go through all this extra effort to make sure that the film is rated G as opposed to PG. I mean, Frozen was rated PG, and newsflash, it didn't scare away many families from seeing the film. But we have to keep it in context with the times. The MPAA rating system, as we know it today, wasn't even established until 1968, and ratings were handled a little bit differently back then with the lack of a PG-13 rating. Jaws, for example, was rated PG, and at the time, no Disney animated film had ever been rated past a G, so there was justifiable uncertainty over what would happen to a Disney film that was rated PG. And despite all the arguments, delays, personnel changes, and general behind-the-scenes turmoil, The Fox and the Hound was released on July 10th, 1981.
Copper, you're my very best friend. And you're mine too, Todd. And we'll always be friends forever, won't we? Yeah, forever.
So clearly, The Fox and the Hound had a, let's call it, turbulent developmental cycle. But could a great movie have still been produced despite the fact that it was a bumpy ride making it? Well, right off the bat, if Disney was going for a different vibe to go with the start of their overhauled studio, they definitely achieved that. The opening is weirdly quiet, with just some violins in the background and a rack-focused introduction. It almost feels like a horror movie in a way, and I kinda like it. Partially because it's different, and partially because it indicates to you that, yeah, this is gonna be a slightly heavier and slightly darker Disney movie than you're used to. Also, when are these characters gonna learn? If you're the mother of a cute woodland animal and you're being pursued by hunters, whatever you do, don't go into the empty field. Trust me, it does not end well for you. And speaking of Bambi, it's almost impossible not to get some Bambi vibes from this film. There's the obvious, of course, with the film being set in a wooded area, but also the mother dying, the parental figure owl, and the movie being split between the innocence of youth and the reality of life when you get older. That's not to say the two movies are identical, mind you. Fox and the Hound definitely has its own vibe and tale to tell from Bambi, but you can definitely see that at least some elements or lessons were borrowed from the previous movie. Is it possible that the death of Todd's mother is actually sadder than the death of Bambi's? I know that feels sort of blasphemous to ask, but watch the scenes back and tell me what you think. While the death of Bambi's mother obviously held more weight because she was a character who we got to know, the desperation in Todd's mother to try to get away and the quick, almost rushed goodbye she has to give to Todd before making one last-ditch effort to escape, oh man, it just hurts the heart. It was scenes like that, though, that gave this movie much more maturity than possibly any Disney animated film prior. Just the plot itself is much more complicated than good versus evil. It's a sober and realistic commentary on how the role society dictates we play as adults can be vastly different from our concerns as kids. There's even arguably no villains in the entire movie, aside from time itself. Sure, you have Amos Slade, who feels unreasonably angry towards Todd throughout the movie, but when you really look at it, he's just a hunter, and going after foxes is just what hunters do, whether their dog is friendly with that fox or not. Though I will say, with Chief not dying, the hard jump that Amos and Copper take into pursuing Todd does make that last point a little bit harder to justify. I can't believe I'm arguing this, but I sort of agree that Chief should have died in order to help Copper's motivation against Todd. Yikes, I just argued for the death of a cartoon dog. I feel like I need a shower and a cry. Even the film's ending is far more nuanced than what we're used to seeing from Disney. Without a real villain to defeat to send the audience home happy, we instead get a bittersweet ending. No, Todd and Copper aren't still going to play every day, and they're not going to have children who grow up being best friends. And that feels sad, especially for younger audiences. But we at least get the knowledge that their friendship remains, even if they don't get to see each other and have some differences due to mutual respect. It's one of those endings and one of those movies that I don't want to say makes more sense when you're older, but it certainly takes on some different meanings and gets a newer understanding when you get older. I think it's arguable that Todd and Copper have one of the most realistic relationships we've ever seen in a Disney movie, before or since. As much as we all love the Aladdin and Jasmines and the Timon and Pumbas of the world, this feels like a much more relatable friendship, especially in the modern day. We may not always get to see our childhood friends or talk to them, and heck, we may even argue with them and drift apart, but that doesn't mean you still can't be friends with them despite all of that. Alright, so we got a little heavy there. Let's try to lighten it up a little bit. I really like the animation in this film, and you can definitely start to see some of the subtle stylistic changes that would be indicative of this new crop of animators. The characters are great as well, and the voice acting is pretty strong throughout, which is saying something considering the two main characters are voiced by children in the early going. I also found myself enjoying the pacing of the film. It certainly progresses a lot faster than I remember, with much more of the film focusing on the older versions of Todd and Copper than I recalled. But in a movie that could have been so bogged down by its heavy scenes, it never feels like too much weight is being put on the viewer. Sure, there's some infinitely sad scenes in this movie. Watch Widow Tweed all but Old Yeller Todd and try not to cry, I dare you. But they're intermixed with comedic relief provided mostly by Dinky and Boomer fairly seamlessly without feeling like the comedic portions were too contrived. And not for nothing, but we may have two of the worst pet owners in existence in this film. On the one hand, you have Widow Tweed, who lets a fox loose in a hen house and then gets angry when he chases them. And on the other, we have Amos Slade, who lets a puppy walk around outside without a leash, then gets angry when he wanders off. Watch your pets, people! The music in the film is pretty interesting as well. You have Best of Friends, which I would argue is the best and certainly the most well-known song in the movie. But aside from that, the songs are kind of oddly constructed. Most of them, like the heartfelt Goodbye May Seem Like Forever, feel almost like poems with a much more sing-talk quality to them. Although this is definitely different and generally not my cup of tea, I actually think that they work pretty well in the context of the film. Everything else is fairly grounded in realism, so not having the characters burst into a Broadway-style number when talking to each other makes sense. And speaking of realistic, it's kind of refreshing to see a movie where the animals can't talk to or otherwise communicate with humans aside from how they can in real life. Helps keep everything a little bit more grounded. So overall, Fox and the Hound is a good but much more weighty Disney movie than we've seen in the past. Maybe it's partially because there are some new voices being heard behind the scenes, but there does seem to be a lot less silliness than in previous features, and in some ways that's probably a good thing. If you haven't watched Fox and the Hound since you were a kid, I would definitely recommend checking it out again, as you may find yourself taking away more from it now than you did back then. And if nothing else, you'll be treating yourself to a pretty entertaining and solid production from Disney. Fox and the Hound opened to average to good reviews, with many critics praising the animation, voice work, and climax, but nearly all of them commented on how the film was missing that extra spark that earlier Disney classics had. The climactic bear battle received almost universal praise, however, both from critics and throughout the animation industry. The film also fared well at the box office, bringing in $39.9 million domestically and $43 million internationally on just a $12 million budget. The film also received some accolades, being nominated for a Young Artist Award and a Saturn Award, while winning a Golden Screen Award. If you've never heard of a Golden Screen Award, that's because it's an award not based off of technical merit, but rather ticket sales. If a movie sells 3 million tickets in 18 months or less, it's eligible for the award, so think of like how Platinum Records work. The life of the Fox and the Hound continued on the comic pages. Beginning actually before the film's release in April of 1981, Richard Moore began adapting the film into comic strip form as part of Walt Disney's Treasury of Classics, a weekly newspaper comic series. And various Fox and the Hound related comics would continue to appear all the way into 2007 in countries such as the USA, Italy, Brazil, France, and the Netherlands. I'm gonna be honest here, of all the Disney films to receive a second life in the comics, The Fox and the Hound wouldn't have been my first choice, but hey, stranger things, right? The film was re-released to theaters in 1988 and received a direct-to-DVD mid-cool in 2006, The Fox and the Hound 2. Alright, quick gripe here. If your movie's a mid-cool and not a sequel, don't put a 2 at the end of it. It's just confusing. So in the end, although The Fox and the Hound suffered from quite a tumultuous production cycle, it can't be denied the impact the film had on the animation world, acting as a launching pad for not only Disney's eventual renaissance in the late 80s and early 90s, but for the various new animators as well, who went on to define the medium for decades to come. It goes without saying that The Fox and the Hound is truly a Disney classic. Well guys, that wraps up for me this week. Hope you all enjoyed, and let me know what your thoughts are on The Fox and the Hound. Also, if you'd like to keep up to date with myself and the channel, be sure to follow my Twitter account, linked down below. And if you'd like to help support the channel, be sure to check out my Patreon page, link also down below, for some exclusive rewards and videos. In fact, I just put up a review of the movie Leap, exclusive for patrons of this channel. And hey, if you like this video, be sure to subscribe to the channel, check out the Disney Guy Review playlist, and my last video. And I'll see you all real soon.